Welcome to the AWIP podcast. I'm your host, Rae Smith. Here we focus on investigations and all things animal welfare related. We're bringing you in depth conversations each week with animal welfare professionals around the globe, so be sure to find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Spotify. To learn more about AWIP and our mission, check us out at awip.org.uk or at awipusa.org. Today really stemmed from several conversations that I had had from professionals around the country in regards to the transparency with shelters and rescues and some concerns that people had had about who did they go to when they have concerns about welfare conditions or regulations for those shelters and rescues. And over time, as I started talking with people about these things, I came to find that through research, a lot of states don't have an overseeing regulatory agency to be able to make sure that these shelters and rescues and pet stores and grooming facilities don't really have a great regulation. And naturally, when I reached out to these different states, I would go to the Department of Agriculture, thinking that they would be the facility to go to who would manage these types of things. And surprisingly, a lot of states don't have that. I would hear back from these Department of Ags from around the country who say, well, we really just kind of regulate chickens or livestock or things like that. And there really was no oversight. So through these conversations, I ended up getting a lot of feedback from people who wanted to hear about a well-run state program who manages different types of animal handling businesses so that they can either create or mirror a similar model. So for everybody who sent that request out, this is the one for you. What I have is Nick Fisher, who is the program section chief of PACFA here in Colorado. So Nick, welcome on. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk today.
I work with you guys a lot, your team, for years and years. Nick, can you kind of give me a background on how you got into animal welfare and how you got to be where you are today?
Sure. So I started out in college. I have a Bachelor of Science in Business Management, which kind of is really good for the position I have now. But I kind of pivoted in my early 20s, and I started out as I got interested in law enforcement. I was a park ranger for the state. So it's called the Colorado Parks and Wildlife now, but wildlife and parks used to be separated back in the day. So I was a seasonal park ranger for a couple of years and really enjoyed it. Obviously, the seasonal part of it, if I could have been full time, it would have been awesome. But back in those days, I was making like $5 an hour, so I had to get a real job. Yeah, I know, crazy, right? So I started looking at some law enforcement positions, and there was an animal control position open with Jefferson County, which is kind of in the foothills here in Colorado. So I got a job with Jefferson County, worked there for 2 years. I really enjoyed it. I worked the mountain district most of the time, so I was up in the mountains and the foothills. And then, kind of looking around at other agencies in Jefferson County, there was an agency over at Wheat Ridge that was kind of my dream job. So I had both animal control and park enforcement. So they did both jobs. And so after a couple of years at Jefferson County, I transitioned over to Wheat Ridge, and we were called Wheat Ridge Animal Park Enforcement. So we basically were park rangers and animal control officers all jammed into one job. So it was like the perfect job for me. So after a year, applied for and became the supervisor of that unit. So we were within the police department. It was a really fantastic job. The police department treated us just like another support unit of the police department. We patrolled the parks. We did animal control. My last 3 years there, we actually took over code enforcement, which is kind of crazy. So we started doing weeds and junk cars and all that kind of stuff. I decided, I was in my mid 40s at that point in time, and I decided if I was ever going to do it, I was going to go be a police officer. So I did that. All the things I knew I wasn't going to like about it, I didn't like about it. So I transitioned back to animal welfare and took over as the executive director of what is now the Foothills Animal Shelter in Golden. Back in the day, it was the Table Mountain Animal Center. So I was the executive director there for 4 years. I left there to start a new shelter, founded it from the ground up, which was the Humane Society of the South Platte Valley, and that's in Littleton, Colorado. So I actually did shelter management for about 7 years. During that time, I got really interested in animal behavior. So I worked closely with Camp Bow Wow. So they actually hired me as a consultant to do dog behavior. So I kind of transitioned over after animal shelters. I kind of ran my own consulting company for a little while. And then I actually went to work for Camp Bow Wow and went around the country and trained in play yard management. Did a lot of dog behavior with the camps there. Did some training, a lot of corporate training, a lot of business analysis training for the franchises in Camp Bow Wow. So I worked out of the corporate office. The PACFA program manager, program administrator job, now it's called the section chief job, became open in 2015, and I jumped at it. So it was a kind of a culmination of all of my experience in my career, and this job was the perfect fit for that. So that's kind of my career in a short synopsis.
Super busy. Sounds like you. How did you ever manage to get a vacation in that time?
You have to try to fit it in, but I don't in my earlier days I didn't take a lot of vacations, I can tell you that. As I
Hmm.
get older I start to take more of my time. So
It's like the story of our life in animal welfare
exactly.
there. So, Nick, I had mentioned I've worked with PACFA for many years now. For those who don't know what PACFA is, who don't have a state agency, can you explain what is PACFA? How was it formed? When and how it was formed?
Absolutely, and it's a really interesting story. PACFA stands for, it's the acronym for the Pet Animal Care, and you always have to put the and in there, Facilities Act, because we just don't regulate facilities, we regulate pet care as well. So PACFA was actually kind of started back in, I want to say 1993 was kind of when it was first, the idea of it came up. Prior to 93, the Colorado Department of Health regulated shelters to some degree. They did boarding kennels, and I think they did a little bit with retail pet stores. Because back when I worked with Wheat Ridge, I know we had some interaction with the Department of Health when like Walmart sold fish or
Mm.
small animals or birds or things like that. um, when you start a regulatory program in Colorado, you have to, in order to get one started, you have to go through what's called a sunrise review. So a sunrise review is basically you go to sometimes like in Colorado, the Department of Regulatory Agencies, it's called DORA. They regulate everybody who has a license. So like doctors, chiropractors, anybody that's a human that has a license is regulated by DORA. So veterinarians. So anybody that wants to be regulated and get licensure for human licensing goes to DORA. So it's called a sunrise review. What was kind of interesting about PACFA back in the day was that the Department of Health decided they were going to sunset their regulation of animal facilities. So, sunset means that every few years the legislature looks at your program and they go, do we want to continue the program or don't we? And oftentimes the agency can say, we don't want to do this anymore. So, the actual regulation sunsets. So during that kind of interim time and usually what happens when it sunsets is you have a year to figure out what the program is going to do, whether it's going to go away altogether or something else is going to happen with it. So between 92, or actually 93 and 1994, that sunset period, actually a task force was started. And back in the day, the Colorado Federation of Animal Welfare Agencies, which is now AWAC, which is the association, the Animal Welfare Association of Colorado, I can never get that acronym right, which transitioned over to PACFA, or transitioned over to from CAFAWA to AWAC. So they were a big part of it. They have always had an advocacy group within CAFAWA or AWAC, and they brought along some of the pet stores, the dog breeders, some of the rescue folks, and they created a task force in conjunction with the Department of Health. And for the next year and a half, this task force met to transition regulation from the Department of Health, and then they requested the Department of Agriculture to administer and regulate the program. So that's kind of how PACFA, the inception of PACFA happened. It actually went through two legislative sessions before it passed. So it was actually passed by the Colorado General Assembly in 1994 and signed by the governor in July of 1994, and that's how PACFA was enacted.
Was that process difficult then when you had to talk with legislators and politicians and stuff for getting this passed? How much of a role did those in within PACFA who wanted to form this play in that? I would imagine that there are a lot of meetings, lot of explanation as to why Colorado needed this formation of a new department.
Yeah, and I know, I mean, I wasn't directly involved back in the day, but I was around, and kind of watched the process happen. So that's how I know about it. From my understanding was there was a lot of meetings, a lot of task force meetings. They had to kind of structure what the regulations were going to look like. They kind of took some of the Department of Health. So the Department of Health was involved heavily because there's still to this day, there's a lot of regulation around zoonotic type diseases like psittacosis with birds, salmonella with reptiles and things like that. So that influence from the Department of Health, obviously came over with what we ended up in PACFA. But you had, talk about this diverse group of people. You had dog breeders coming to the table, cat breeders, shelters, and rescues who have this, oppositional viewpoint on animal welfare, all coming to the table to say, yeah, we want to be regulated. And I think that was the biggest. If I can pass that along to other people that want to do this, I think creating a task force of people that are interested in doing this and getting as many diverse groups as you can together so that when you do go to the legislature, they go, wow, this group represents a lot of people, because kind of what happens is if you have, and we see this with legislation every year, is you have these differing viewpoints and, people that come in and go, yeah, we're all collaborating on this. We're all in this together. It's an easy win for a legislator, so they can run your bill and they can get buy-in from other folks, in the General Assembly. So that would be my recommendation for people that want to do this.
Which is traditionally like oppositionally resistant for when we have these discussions about puppy mills and breeders, and you have these organizations who shelters, rescues, animal welfare advocates wanting these restrictions, wanting to pass these laws and such, and then you have the actual breeders who of course don't, because it ends up ruining their business. So I think that's a good point, is the task force and having all these different stakeholders involved to show that there is a unity of people across different fields who are in favor of this type of thing.
And I think from a business perspective, if you're a dog breeder or a pet store or even a boarding facility that, you provide services to the public, I think having a state regulatory agency be your stamp of approval helps your business, tremendously. Because I think people know, hey, this is regulated. I can trust it. If there is something that goes wrong, there's a state agency that I can talk to and make a complaint to. And I think a lot of businesses recognize, hey, this is a really good thing. And I think, for our purposes, the shelters hold themselves to a really high standard. This is a way to say, hey, we want higher regulation. We want to be regulated. The dog breeders, coming to the table say, yeah, we want to be regulated. We don't want to have puppy mills in Colorado. And so I think it was just a huge, back in the day, that was a huge thing at the time.
Yeah. So I mean, you guys are incredibly busy all the time. You really manage a lot of different licensure and businesses within the state. What type of businesses in particular does PACFA regulate, and what laws do PACFA inspectors enforce?
So there's a couple different components to this. So you have the actual statute, which is the act, so the Pet Animal Care and Facilities Act. And so that act is, I want to say, about 34 pages, which is pretty big for an act. And I think back in the day is like the first go around when they tried to pass this is like they tried to put all the rules and regulations into the act as well, which made it unwieldy. Mm-hmm. And I think the second go around they took a lot of that out and they said, we're going to promulgate rules and regulations separately. So we have the act and then we have the rules and regulations. So the rules and regulations are more than 50 pages, and that gets on the weeds on pretty much, how we inspect things, what are violations, what are not violations. So we regulate and we add businesses because we can add categories of licensure through the rules. So we right now regulate the 16 categories of licensure. So anybody that pretty much does anything with pets in Colorado is regulated. So we regulate animal shelters, And then those are broken up into subcategories of large and small. And so a large shelter is anybody that transfers more than 3,000 animals. A small shelter is anybody that transfers less than 3,000 animals. We regulate pet sanctuaries. So these are people that keep animals indefinitely. We regulate rescues, and those are broken up into small and large as well. So those are over 100 transfers for a large, under 100 for small. We regulate boarding facilities, boarding and training facilities. So if anybody does any care of animals outside the presence of the owner, they have to be licensed. So somebody who does it in their home and keeps more than 3 animals has to be licensed with us. If they train without the owner present, they have to have a license with us. We do sled dog facilities. We do hunting club facilities. We do people that exhibit animals. So, like SeaQuest, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of SeaQuest, but SeaQuest was an interactive aquarium that was in a mall. And they had all these animals that kids can go in and play with, like iguanas and things like that. So, think about that kind of nightmare. Um, so, um, so we license wolf hybrid facilities, so they exhibit animals as well. Dog daycares, so they commingle dogs, and they care for animals out of the presence of an owner, so they have to have a boarding and training license. Breeders, dog breeders, cat breeders, bird breeders, herptiles, which includes reptiles and amphibians, small mammals. We do what we call retail pet establishments, which are pet stores that sell to the public. Wholesale pet dealerships which sell to pet stores. So if a dog breeder sells their dogs to a pet store, they have to have a wholesale pet animal dealership license. And I think I've covered grooming. So grooming is one of our biggest categories. There's different subcategories of grooming. Mobile dog washes. We regulate independent contractor groomers. We regulate self-wash facilities like the ones at the car wash. So yeah. So I think I've covered pretty much everybody.
That list is just about as long as your gigantic handbook of rules and regulations. It's a lot.
So on an annual basis, we have about 2,200 licenses, and those 2,200 licenses do about 3,000 business activities. So a facility can have multiple licenses. So like a dog daycare could also do grooming. And so they would have multiple licenses.
By your statistics, your estimations, what percentage of animal handling businesses do you think are in compliance, licensed as appropriately as they should be in the state?
That's a great question. So I guess I can address that question this way. So we handle unlicensed complaints as well. So we actually have, as part of my staff, I have like 1.5 investigators. So one of my inspectors is a hybrid. So she's an inspector and an investigator. So typically our program on whole averages about 750 complaints a year. Out of that 750 complaints, approximately 30 to 33% of those are on unlicensed facilities. And we can kind of get into unlicensed facilities and kind of what that means later on, or we can talk about it now if you want to do that.
Yeah, let's talk about it now. Like so you have inspectors and you have investigators. What's the difference? Why are they separated? And what kind of inspections and investigations do they do?
So for the inspection field team, like I just said, we have 2,200 facilities. So that breaks out to about 350 to 400 facilities per inspector. So all the inspectors are geographically located, so we hire them pretty much for the territory they're going to cover. For instance, I have a Western Slope inspector, and she's in Montrose. I have a Northeastern inspector who lives in Greeley. My Southeast inspector lives in south of Pueblo. So they're all geographically located. So each of these inspectors has 350 to 400 facilities that our program goal is to try to get into these facilities at least once a year and do a routine inspection. The reason for that is the more that we're in the facility, the more contact we have with these facilities, the better compliance that we're going to get. When I took this program over, we were under a performance audit because the program wasn't doing inspections. There were facilities that hadn't been inspected in 4 years, and they were using a risk-based system, which USDA uses because they don't have enough inspectors. Yep. So we tried to hire as many inspectors as we could within the budget that we had to be able to try to get into each facility once a year. The more you get in there, the more compliance you have, the less you have to go back and do follow-up inspections or failed inspections or anything like that. So that's the philosophy behind that. We also, because of the unlicensed component of this, we have a full-time investigator, and she covers 3/4 of the state, and all she does is unlicensed facilities. So an unlicensed facility comprises, we deal with a lot of animal hoarding issues. So the nice thing about PACFA is that under the shelter regulations, anybody that keeps, houses, or harbors, for instance, and we can go through each species of animal, but for dogs and cats, if you harbor, house, or keep more than 15 in a central location, you have to have a license with PACFA. So if you go into a cat hoarding situation and this person has 80 cats, they're in violation of PACFA. We can issue a cease and desist order, and then we usually work with animal control to either help them relinquish the animals to get into compliance, or sometimes we'll have to go to court to get an injunction in order for the court to tell them that they have to get rid of a bunch of animals. So that's how we kind of deal with the unlicensed component in a shelter situation.
I know you kind of went into it a little bit, but I just really want to highlight how important and how much of an impact that PACFA has had on facilities and animal control agencies within the state. Your position and your department is so critical for the work in the humane treatment of animals. So from an inside PACFA perspective, why is having a state regulatory agency so critical for the humane treatment of animals and animal handling business operations within Colorado?
So I think one of the fantastic things about PACFA is that within our rules and regulations, we have standards. So there's minimum standards that are set. There's also requirements for veterinary care. So some of the minimum standards are facility standards, for example. So in shelters and retail facilities, the surfaces have to be water resistant. So how that helps animal welfare is that you're not going to have germs sitting in a surface that's, a porous or anything like that, where it can create mold or the bacteria can sit and the germs can sit. So those water resistant surfaces are easily cleaned. The cages are easily cleaned. So those are types of physical facility standards. We have cleaning and sanitation requirements for all our facilities. So our rule is what we call a common standards rule. So the rules apply to pretty much every category of licensure. So there may be some higher standards for like shelters and retail facilities, and then the minimum standards apply to everybody else. So cleaning and sanitation, we have what's called classification and separation rules, which means in a dog daycare, there's a supervisory requirement for dogs that are commingled. So that supervisor requirement is for 1 to 15 dogs, you have to have one supervisor. If it's over 15, you have to have two. When it gets over 30, you have to have three. So it, kind of expands upon that. And then you can't have any more than 60 dogs in a play yard. So we're controlling commingled dogs in those environments. We have feeding requirements. We have veterinary care requirements. Facilities have to provide timely veterinary care if an animal gets injured in their facility. What that means is, like if a dog starts experiencing bloat, there's an agreement with the owner that they can take the animal to the vet right away, and we regulate that. If they don't do that, then that's a violation. We have that for shelters as well. So if they have an animal that's sick in their shelter and they don't get veterinary care for it, or they don't call a veterinarian in to take care of it, that's a violation. Isolation requirements. Animals that have communicable diseases have to be isolated, and this goes across the board for all facilities. We have special requirements. So in the last couple of years, we passed regulations so people have to have a disaster plan, or what we call a contingency plan. Shelters and rescues have to provide enrichment for animals in their care. If they have any behavior that's, non-normal or stereotypical behavior or anything like that, they have to do an individualized treatment plan or behavior plan. And then we also have what we call a disease control and treatment plan. So we have a lot of shelters and rescues that import animals into Colorado from other states. So kind of what we found is that consumers, was a consumer protection issue, still is a consumer protection issue, where a lot of adopters end up getting an animal and it starts becoming sick once they've adopted it, because the turnover by a rescue or a shelter is so fast that they didn't quarantine the animal or anything like that. So we require those facilities to kind of have a support system all the way from the source shelter to when the animal's adopted. And they have to have a plan on how they're going to mitigate and control disease. And then last but not least, we have record keeping requirements, which are really important for all the animals in a facility, for breeders, for shelters, just to be able to trace an animal all the way from when they got the animal to when the animal was adopted or sold. And then transportation requirements. So for facilities that transport animals, like animal transporters that bring animals into the state to a shelter, there's regulations around, they can't stack crates on top of each other without some type of barrier. They have to be able to get to the animals so that the animals, if there's an accident or something like that, they can get the animals out really quick. So just regulations like that cover this whole gamut of anything that could potentially happen in a facility we're trying to regulate.
So the regulations and standards of care that you were talking about for PACFA sound very akin to that which is the basic standards of care that is in the Animal Welfare Act that the USDA APHIS team regulates on a federal level. Only the key difference here is that based on the explanations and the different categories that you guys manage and look for is a much higher standard from what the AWA inspects. And then along the same lines with what you said, they're doing the inspections at least once a year, if not more. And I think that that's a really key point to make, is that the benefit of having this state regulated agency who does these inspections and everything with a smaller caseload than what the USDA's APHIS team has. It has an effect on these businesses, animal control agencies, shelters, rescues, all of these different agencies or businesses that you regulate, and the animals, of course, as well. So I think that from my perspective, that's one of the glaringly obvious main benefits of having a state program, to be able to go in and create better conditions that it would take forever to be changed through Congress to make amendments to the Animal Welfare Act.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and not to try to be controversial, but we get, ever since I've been here, there's been advocacy groups that want to, do legislation around puppy mills, and one of the things I've said is because we have a regulation in Colorado, a puppy mill is a substandard dog breeder, right? And so in order to be a substandard dog breeder, you have to be under the minimum standards. And in Colorado, they're regulated, so they meet the minimum standards. And so there's no substandard dog breeders in Colorado because we regulate them. So, it's kind of like this, catch-22. It's like, you can try to regulate puppy mills, but we really don't have a puppy mill problem in Colorado because there's regulation in place.
PACFA does conduct investigations and inspections around the state. How does that work exactly? What is the process behind these agents going out and conducting these?
So we basically operate from a complaint based. We don't have time to do a lot of initiated enforcement. So most of our complaints come in. We have a complaint portal on our website, or people can email us. We want complaints to come in writing so that we actually have a statement from the complainant. So that's kind of how we work. We'll take complaints from animal control agencies, sheriff's departments, local law enforcement. We pretty much take complaints, from anybody in the general public. So that initiates the complaint. The complaints are then assigned or triaged based on if they're a licensed facility or an unlicensed facility. If they're a licensed facility, then they go to the inspector in that territory where that facility resides. If they're unlicensed, then they either get assigned to main investigator who does 3/4 of the state, or then our investigator who's assigned to like a quarter of the state that gets assigned to her area. So the differentiation between unlicensed and licensed is we could have somebody that complains about an unlicensed dog breeder. So we'll go investigate that and see if they meet the threshold requirements. So there's, under the definitions and the rules, for a dog breeder, hobby breeders are defined by statute and rule. If they produce 2 litters or less, then they're considered a hobby breeder and they're not regulated. If they produce more than 3 litters or do more than 24 transfers a year, then they're required to have a license. So a lot of times with the unlicensed stuff, there's a lot of social media investigation that happens prior to going out and doing a site inspection or a site investigation. to determine if they're actually advertising, because advertising without a license is also a violation under the statute. So people can't operate without a license and they can't advertise without a license. So they can't advertise to provide goods, services, or anything else that requires a license. So those are kind of how our unlicensed investigations work. For the license component of that, somebody could complain about, smell, odor. My dog got injured while it was in dog daycare. We investigate that. My dog escaped, or the facility has to self-report escapes and deaths. So we do investigations on that. So just a myriad of different complaints that come in. So maybe I can help with this from people that are interested in starting a program like this.
Yes.
Usually in Colorado, the legislature really likes programs that fund themselves. And so PACFA is what we call a cash fund. So there's two different ways funding can come to a program. So it's either through general funds, which are through taxes, or a cash fund. So PACFA is funded by a cash fund, which means all of the license fees go to pay for the administration and enforcement of the program. So we get a small sliver of general fund money, which we got from our last sunset review to hire a couple more inspectors. But for the most part, we operate totally on a cash basis. So all the license fees come in. That happens every March, and then that funds our program. So it funds everything. It funds, our payroll. It funds our vehicles. It funds the whole 9 yards. So the license fee has to be high enough to support the program. So for anybody that's thinking about starting this, and I talked to California recently, it's like that's one of the big questions they had. And I said, if you can walk into the legislature with this idea of this package and say, hey, the license fees are going to go to pay for the program, I think you'll be really successful in trying to get legislation through.
It's so important. I mean, it seems like everything boils down to funds and money and how are we going to pay for these things, of course. And it's an election year. So, not wanting to raise taxes and everything like that's, I think, a huge, critical, major component to it. So I'm glad that you mentioned that you talked about it. So Nick, before we wrap up, I just kind of want to talk about some of the successes that PACFA has had in Colorado and how it has benefited the municipal animal protection agencies here. I know that there are tons and tons of cases. There are several cases that I'm aware of who have made the news. But just to highlight, like, PACFA is such a well-run program, and there have been so many successful cases that you and your team have investigated. And I want to talk a little bit about those and how those successes have helped benefit the animal control agencies around the state as well.
Yeah, so thank you for the compliments. We really appreciate that. I think the biggest thing for us is that we want to be a resource for local animal control agencies or county animal control agencies. And we do come at it from a different direction because the animal control agencies are usually concerned about the animal welfare part of it or neglect. And so, a lot of times we try to work jointly with those organizations because under PACFA, we don't really have the authority to enforce animal cruelty or animal neglect. So we actually, and by statute, we actually are required to report that to the local law enforcement jurisdiction. So on our side of it, we can address the administrative issues or the rule and regulation issues for an unlicensed facility. It's more about, the animal thresholds. And if they're over, then we can we can come at it from that side of it, where the animal control agency can come at it from the animal welfare side of it. So we've done a lot of joint investigations with animal control at the local level, a lot down in southern Colorado with HSPPR, to where, the investigations are joint, concurrently running. They're doing an animal cruelty investigation. We're doing a disciplinary action on the license if they're licensed. If they're not licensed, then we're running a cease and desist order case. If they don't cease and desist the activity, then we go to a permanent injunction. So we're going to district court. And if they don't comply at that point, then they're in contempt of court, and we can do both criminal and remedial charges for that and actually put people in jail. And we do have a small criminal provision within statute to where if people don't comply with the cease and desist order, that's a class 2 misdemeanor. If they operate without a license, it's a class 2 misdemeanor. If they advertise without a license, it's a class 2 misdemeanor. So a lot of times we'll run 2 cases on our own where we're doing a criminal case and we're doing an administrative case where we're taking the permanent injunction route, but we've also filed a criminal case with the DA's office. And then the Animal Control Agency is doing their investigation and potentially running an animal cruelty case. So it meshes really well together when we do these kind of investigations, and that's how we've helped animal control, all over the state.
When it comes to checks and balances and transparency, so you had mentioned that PACFA, years ago had gone through a sunset review. They're going through a sunset review right now. Coming back to like the original reason of why I thought that this was so important for other executive directors and leadership within other states who want to develop a program like this is that focusing on accountability and having that checks and balances is that there's so many states right now who don't have really oversight into these programs or into even state-run shelters, right? If there's a problem there, who's going to investigate? And a lot of states just don't have an answer for that. But PACFA has the same thing. So going through these sunset reviews and making sure that the program is working and that it's beneficial and that, there's a purpose behind it. So I really like the idea of private businesses, and then you have state government, shelters, agencies, and such, private breeders, rescues from in and out of state, and then PACFA, like all working together just to like improve animal welfare overall. But there's the importance of that is that there's this checks and balances, even for PACFA, and the transparency behind that as well. Most agencies want to have that to be able to prove and show that their data and statistics are founded and that there's a purpose behind it. So for me, I've seen just with the work that I've done that is something that's pretty core to PACFA as well is just the transparency.
Yeah, and I think one of the cool things too, and I think this was built in the beginning of PACFA, is that there's a reporting requirement for facilities too. For example, shelters and rescues have to report like all the intake and outtake of the animals that go in, and they have to report that to PACFA, and then we publish that report, so it becomes a public report. So it's not only transparency for PACFA, but it's also transparency for the shelter and rescue community to show all of the good work they do. In the last few years, it's like I think Colorado, prior to the pandemic, was at almost like a 95% live release rate as a community for shelters and rescues for both dogs and cats. So I think that's something, that we can show in Colorado. Look, this is the kind of work we do, and it's not just the state agency that's doing it. We're showcasing, this is what our organizations in Colorado do. So, and I think it benefits business all the way around because it's like, the state of Colorado is very, as everybody knows, very pro pet, and it just showcases the good work that everybody does in Colorado.
I appreciate you coming on. The purpose of these podcasts, these episodes, is really to put a reason and a point behind it to try and drive change just to better animal welfare in general, whether it's for people who don't professionally work in there and want to become more educated, or if we do have professionals in the field who just want to hear a different perspective or want to learn more in depth on a more advanced level of how they can help in their communities, in their state, in their local jurisdictions. So just really appreciate all of the work that you guys do over at PACFA. I have seen the work and the effect of it on my end for the last several years that I've been in Colorado, and I know how beneficial it has been for the community, for pets, for shelters, officers, just in general. And I hope that this upcoming sunset review goes well. And, I just want to say thank you very much for coming on and talking about PACFA and really explaining to people who want to start a program themselves in their state. Now they kind of have a little bit of a roadmap and see the benefits and can relay that information to their legislators to get that started.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. If anybody, I'm always happy to help anybody who has questions or anything like that. I think I was telling you before we started recording that, I recently talked to California, and they have a shelter group that, had a bunch of questions. So I got on a video call with them and talked them through a bunch of their questions. So I'm always happy to help do that. I think what I was going to bring up earlier was I think there's only about 10 or 11 states that have anything like PACFA. So I think it would be really great on a national level if more states did something like PACFA, like, you're talking about. I think the better regulation we can have across the country, for animal welfare, I think would be great. So again, thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in and supporting the AWIP podcast and just supporting PACFA in general, too. So it's been nice to just see everybody's interest in this. So thanks for tuning in to the AWIP podcast, and we'll see you next week.